Welcome to Cognitive Dose. We are here, as always, curing blind spots, cultivating intellect, and shattering cognitive bias. Today, we're turning our analytical lens onto a text that has really fundamentally rewired Silicon Valley's operational psychology.
Oh, absolutely. It's inescapable.
Right. I'm talking about Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. Our objective today is to rigorously dissect the book's thesis on technological innovation, the architecture of business building, and its underlying philosophy of how humanity basically creates a better future. But I want to lay out the book's foundational frameworks first, just to ensure we truly understand the architecture of these ideas before we start evaluating them.
And I come at it from a slightly different way, which is why I've been really looking forward to this discussion, because while the text is treated as almost, sacred operating instructions in the tech world, I am prepared to heavily cross-examine its premises.
Naturally.
Yeah, I want to warn the listener right now, actually. We cannot accept its superficial wisdom or its sweeping macroeconomic claims at face value. We need to look under the hood and see what is actually holding these ideas up.
Which is exactly why we're doing this. So let's start with the fundamental premise of the text, which rests on this dichotomy of progress. The author divides human advancement into two distinct categories, right? Horizontal or extensive progress, and vertical or intensive progress.
Right, the 1 to N versus the 0 to 1 concept?
Precisely. So horizontal progress means copying things that already work. It is going from 1 to N. At a macro level, the single word for horizontal progress is globalization, taking an idea that functions in one location, like a railroad or a smartphone, and scaling it globally. Vertical progress, on the other hand, means doing something entirely new. It is going from 0 to 1. If you take a typewriter and build 100 of them, that's horizontal.
Right.
But if you have a typewriter and you invent a word processor, that is vertical. The single word for vertical progress is technology.
And it's a compelling framing. I mean, it makes intuitive sense that creating a completely new paradigm is vastly different from merely replicating an old one.
It is. But from this dichotomy, the text derives its most provocative economic assertion. And this is where it gets really interesting. The book argues that capitalism and competition are actually opposites.
Yeah, which is quite the claim.
Right, because in standard economic theory, perfect competition is the ideal state. But the book argues that under perfect competition, all profits basically get competed away. It uses the example of a local restaurant in a highly competitive market in Chicago.
Sure.
That restaurant is fighting so viciously for these really thin margins against a dozen other identical restaurants that it has to pay minimum wage and battle daily just to survive.
Because the product is undifferentiated. I mean, if they raise the price of their burger by $1, the customer just walks next door.
Exactly. In contrast, the text points to what it calls creative monopolies, companies like Google. Because Google offers a search engine that is an order of magnitude, or like 10x, better than any substitute, they effectively do not have to compete.
Right.
This allows them to capture massive lasting profits. And the book's argument is that those monopoly profits are a feature, not a bug of capitalism. Those profits empower the company to fund long-term research, treat their employees exceptionally well, and drive genuine human progress.
So essentially, vertical progress requires monopoly.
That is the assertion, yes. And to achieve this vertical progress, the text vehemently rejects the concept of luck, or the lottery ticket mentality that kind of pervades modern business culture. It dismisses the idea that success is merely a patchwork of arbitrary advantages, as popularized by writers like Malcolm Gladwell, or an ovarian lottery, as Warren Buffett calls it. Instead, the book advocates for intelligent design. A startup is presented as the largest endeavor over which a single founder can have definite mastery.
And this is where we get into the venture capital math, right? The power law.
Yes, exactly. This intelligent design relies entirely on the power law of venture capital. The power law dictates that one breakthrough company will exponentially outperform all other investments combined.
Right.
If a venture capital fund makes 10 investments, they aren't looking for each to return 10%. They fully expect most to fail, but they need one to return 100 times the initial investment, covering all the losses and making the fund wildly profitable. Therefore, the book argues, every startup must be built from day one with the potential to dominate its market and scale to a monopolistic level.
Which obviously requires a very specific type of organization to execute.
It does. The text outlines the ideal sociological makeup of the company that will execute this intelligent design. The ideal culture is described as a tight-knit mafia, or what the author provocatively calls a less extreme kind of cult.
A cult, right.
Yeah, these organizations are entirely distinct from the hyper-professional mercenary culture of, say, a standard corporate consulting firm. And at the helm of this cult-like organization is the singular, distinctive founder.
The visionary.
The visionary, who often exhibits traits that place them at the extreme ends of the human bell curve. The text notes that successful founders, like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, are often simultaneously insiders and outsiders, deeply nerdy yet undeniably alpha figures.
Mm-hmm.
They operate as the prime movers who force the future into existence through sheer will and definite optimism. So that's the foundation. We have the necessity of vertical progress, the ideology of monopoly, the mechanics of the power law, and the cult of the singular founder.
All right, I think you've laid the foundation fairly. But I want to aggressively attack this central underlying premise that monopolies are the ideal state of business.
Okay, let's hear it.
Treating this as generalized macroeconomic wisdom is deeply fundamentally flawed. I mean, the text frames perfect competition as this destructive force that ruins profit margins. But it entirely ignores the immense social utility, the sheer economic efficiency, and the massive consumer surplus that competitive free markets actually generate.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. If a business is just scraping by, how does it innovate?
But look at who benefits when that local restaurant is fighting for margins. The consumer benefits. Prices go down, quality goes up, and the surplus value, what economists call consumer surplus, you know the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they actually pay, is transferred from the producer to the public.
Right, but
The text acts as if the profit margin of the business owner is the sole metric of societal health. That is a radically warped view of economics. Perfect competition might be bad for the specific capitalist, but it is incredibly beneficial for society at large. Monopolies, by definition, restrict output and raise prices to capture that surplus for themselves.
that's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently, using the text's own analogy, which contrasts the U.S. airline industry with Google.
Okay.
The airlines are fiercely competitive. In 2012, they created $160 billion in value, serving millions of passengers. But because of that intense, perfect competition, they made only 37 cents per passenger trip.
Wow.
Yeah. Google, on the other hand, brought in $50 billion, but kept 21% of its revenues as profit. The argument here is that the airlines are trapped in a brute struggle for survival. They literally cannot innovate. Google's monopoly profits are what allow it to invest in self-driving cars, deep artificial intelligence, new infrastructure. As the text states, in 19th century physics, equilibrium means stasis, and in business, stasis means death.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that defense. You actually just made my exact point for me.
How so?
The airlines provided massive democratic utility to millions of passengers precisely because of competition. Working-class families who could never afford to travel were suddenly able to fly across the country. That is not stasis. That is the democratization of human mobility. The fact that the airlines only made 37 cents per passenger is a triumph of the free market, not a failure.
But if they don't have the capital to invest in faster, safer, or cleaner planes, the industry stagnates.
But they aren't the ones who need to innovate the planes. Boeing and Airbus do that. The airline is just a service provider. What the text does is it takes standard, old-fashioned rent-seeking and rebrands it as a creative monopoly.
Rent-seeking?
Yes. Think about it this way. Look at independent app developers on a digital storefront today. They are fiercely competitive, right? Fighting for 99-cent downloads. It's brutal for the developers, but the consumer gets infinite, rapid innovation practically for free. Meanwhile, the platform owner sits as the monopoly toll collector, taking a massive cut of everything without making the apps themselves.
Calling that rent-seeking a creative monopoly just gives them a philosophical excuse to hoard the surplus.
Once that initial vertical innovation is done, the monopoly acts like any other monopoly. It builds walls, it acquires threats, and it crushes dissent.
Okay. You're arguing that they use creative monopoly as a shield for anti-competitive behavior once they reach the top. But let us transition to the methodology of how these companies are built in the first place.
Sure. The text argues that we can purposefully design these creative monopolies by focusing on vertical progress and utilizing the power law. It's not just about luck.
And that is exactly my second point of attack. If monopolies are the ultimate goal, how does the book actually prove we can predictably build them?
Well,
It doesn't. When you look under the hood of this intelligent design theory, it completely lacks analytical rigor. The entire framework is built on survivorship bias and cherry-picked anecdotes.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, honestly, because the text does offer a rigorous predictive framework. It doesn't just say, build a great product and hope. It offers the 7 questions that every business must answer to survive.
The 7 questions. Right. Engineering, timing, monopoly, people, distribution, durability, and secret.
Exactly. And the author explicitly uses this framework to analyze the massive failure of the 2000s clean tech bubble. He points out that companies like Solyndra failed because they couldn't answer these questions. They had non-technical CEOs in suits, they had incremental technology rather than a 10x breakthrough, and they had no plan to dominate a small niche market first.
Conversely, the text argues that Tesla succeeded precisely because it correctly answered all 7 questions. They started with a tiny monopoly, the high-end electric sports car market, and used those profits to scale. That demonstrates a systemic methodology, not just survivorship bias.
See, that is textbook post hoc rationalization. It is incredibly easy to look backward at Tesla, see that it survived, and say, they answered the 7 questions. It is equally easy to look at the rubble of the clean tech industry and say, they failed because they didn't answer them. But the framework fits the outcomes.
Solyndra actually had incredible engineering for cylindrical solar panels, and they timed the exact same government loans Tesla did. They failed primarily because the price of Chinese silicon plummeted. That was a massive, unpredictable macroeconomic shock.
But Tesla navigated its own shocks. The argument is that intelligent design makes a company robust enough to survive them.
But the text treats the power law as a broad predictive tool, this idea that you can intelligently design your way to being the extreme outlier. Mathematically, the power law is descriptive, it's not prescriptive. It describes a fat-tailed distribution, where the extremes are far more likely and impactful than a normal bell curve.
Right.
But the fundamental mathematical reality of a fat-tailed distribution is that you cannot reliably predict the specific outliers. You cannot intelligently design a black swan. And we know this because the mathematical failure of applying the power law as a predictive tool is actually evidenced by the massive losses of the author's own macro hedge fund, Clarium Capital, in the real world. You can't use venture capital startup math to predict global macroeconomics.
So you view the framework as essentially retrofitting a narrative onto chaos?
Completely. I mean, the book literally traps itself in its own logical paradox. In the chapter rejecting the lottery ticket mentality, the author explicitly admits that you cannot run scientific experiments on companies. The book literally states, and I quote, "Statistics doesn't work when the sample size is 1. He is referencing Facebook.
Right, because there's only one Facebook. You can't rewind time and see if Mark Zuckerberg succeeds under different conditions.
Exactly. If statistics don't work when the sample size is 1, then how can you possibly claim that your intelligent design framework is empirically valid? The book cherry-picks the 1990s dot-com boom, calling the peak of that insane bubble a peak of clarity where people saw the future.
Yeah.
Then, it turns around and calls the 2000s clean tech bubble a delusion. What is the actual difference? The difference is simply that the author's social and financial circle made money in the former and not the latter. It is retrofitting a narrative of intelligent design to fit the winners of the power law after the fact.
You are suggesting that the dichotomy the text draws between definite optimism, having a concrete plan for the future, and indefinite optimism, just keeping optionality open because the future is a lottery, is flawed because the future actually is highly stochastic.
Yes, which brings me directly to my third attack angle. If we accept that this methodology is mathematically flawed and relies heavily on luck, we have to look at the human element.
Who exactly gets to wield this supposed intelligent design?
The singular founder, the leader of the mafia.
Right. And when you strip away the Silicon Valley buzzwords, the book is pushing an inherently elitist, completely anti-democratic, and almost monarchical view of human progress.
Monarchical?
Absolutely. It attacks the idea of democratic consensus. It attacks the wisdom of crowds. Instead, it relies on this incredibly toxic assumption that a select few visionary founders should operate completely outside of market constraints and democratic oversight to intelligently design the future for the rest of us. It claims that humanity is stuck in a stagnant state of indefinite optimism and that only these extreme individuals can save us.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that the text is deeply self-aware of that exact danger? The author explicitly cautions against this.
Really?
Yes. He writes that the greatest danger for a founder is to become so certain of his own myth that he loses his mind. He specifically warns that founders must not become Ayn Randian prime movers who believe in their own divine self-sufficiency. He acknowledges that the hero worship of the founder is a double-edged sword that can easily lead to demonization and scapegoating.
I think that warning is just rhetorical cover, though. If you look at the actual culture the book prescribes, it directly contradicts that warning. You cannot warn against being an Ayn Randian prime mover in one paragraph while the entire rest of the book serves as a literal manifesto for Ayn Randian prime movers.
How so? The book argues that extreme alignment within a company is just more efficient.
It goes way beyond efficiency. Look at the language. It actively praises companies that operate as less extreme kinds of cults. Let's think about the mechanics of a cult. Why does a cult move so fast? Because there is zero internal friction.
Right.
And why is there zero internal friction? Because dissent is systematically eliminated and critical thinking is completely suspended in favor of the leader's vision. That might work brilliantly for building a software monopoly and making a few people incredibly rich, but it is disastrous as a model for human progress.
Well, the argument is that a startup requires that level of fanatical dedication because it is trying to bring a secret into the world that everyone else has missed. A bureaucracy can't do that.
But it glorifies mafias led by alpha nerds who view the rest of society as blind. The ideology here is incredibly clear. The masses are stuck, the competitive free market is a destructive force of sameness, and true progress can only be delivered by autocratic founders who build walled garden monopolies. That is not just bad economics. It is a deeply toxic and anti-democratic ideology that elevates the tech billionaire to the status of a philosopher king, completely unaccountable to the public.
We have covered immense ground today. We began by establishing the text's advocacy for vertical progress, the rejection of competition in favor of creative monopolies, and the application of the power law through a singular visionary founder. We then watched you systematically deconstruct this framework, arguing that monopolies basically hoard consumer surplus, that the intelligent design methodology is steeped in survivorship bias and mathematical impossibility, and that the underlying philosophy is profoundly elitist and unaccountable.
And I will not soften those conclusions. The worship of monopolies, the total reliance on survivorship bias disguised as a repeatable methodology, and the autocratic elitism, these are not bugs in the text's operating system. They are its fundamental source code.
Then we will let those brutal critiques stand completely unresolved. We will leave the intellectual discomfort hanging right there in the air. Listeners, you must use this rigorous teardown to actively build your mental immunity. Do not ingest ideology without analyzing the structural integrity of its claims. Remember to subscribe to Cognitive Dose. Keep your intellect cultivated, and we will see you next time.